The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall, narrow windows of the county courthouse, casting pale streaks of light across the polished wooden benches. The building itself carried an old, almost solemn weight. Its marble floors echoed every footstep. Its heavy doors creaked with a sound that seemed to remind each person walking through them that this was no ordinary place. Justice, judgment, and consequence lingered in the air, making the atmosphere heavier than the warm September air outside. Inside courtroom 3, a strange stillness settled over the people gathered. Lawyers shuffled papers and adjusted their ties, but even those small sounds seemed too loud, almost disrespectful in the charged silence. The judge, a woman with kind but firm eyes, sat tall at the bench. She wore her robe with a dignity that came not just from authority, but from years of watching countless human dramas play out in that very room. She had presided over criminal trials, custody battles, and heartbreaking testimonies, but today felt different even to her. On one of the front benches, barely tall enough to swing his legs over the edge, sat a toddler. The child's presence seemed almost unreal in that heavy environment. The boy, no more than 3 years old, was dressed neatly in a small collared shirt and khaki pants, though his hair still carried the tousled look of a child who had resisted the morning comb. Clutched tightly in his small hands was a worn stuffed toy, a floppy-eared rabbit whose fur had long since faded from washing and love. The boy's wide brown eyes darted nervously around the room. To him, the space must have felt enormous, cavernous, and full of strange faces. Adults moved with purpose, speaking in hushed voices, their expressions grave. No one smiled. No one offered the easy warmth the child craved. The boy's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, and his small fingers picked anxiously at the rabbit's ear. He didn't cry, though his lips quivered slightly as if tears sat close, waiting. The attorneys seated at their tables stole occasional glances at the child, but none lingered. They had jobs to do, questions to ask, evidence to present, arguments to frame. Yet even they could not completely ignore the tender image in front of them. A toddler in a courtroom was unusual. For some, unsettling. For others, heartbreaking. It was a reminder that the law was not always about adults making mistakes or disputes over money. Sometimes the smallest, most fragile lives ended up in the center of battles they could not understand. In the gallery, the handful of people permitted to observe shifted uncomfortably. Some crossed their arms, others lowered their eyes, each one struck by the weight of what was about to unfold. The hush in the air wasn't just courtroom etiquette, it was an instinctive response to the innocents sitting before them. This wasn't just another case. Everyone felt it, though none dared say it out loud. The bailiff, a tall man with a calm presence, stood by the door. His eyes softened when they landed on the boy, though his posture remained firm. He, too, understood the unspoken tension. In his years working security for the court, he had seen hardened criminals, raging tempers, and bitter disputes, but few moments tugged at him like this one. He had children of his own at home. He couldn't help but imagine how they would look if placed in that same chair. A thought made his throat tighten. At the bench, the judge glanced briefly at the child, then shifted her gaze back to her notes. Her expression didn't falter, but her mind lingered on him. She had been briefed earlier that morning. A toddler might need to give testimony. The very idea had made her pause. It was not something she had encountered often in her career. The law required delicacy when dealing with children so young, and there were strict guidelines to follow. But guidelines could not erase human emotion. And the judge, despite her years of practiced neutrality, felt her heart ache at the thought. The clock ticked softly on the wall, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. Each tick seemed to stretch the anticipation further. Everyone was waiting, though for what, none could say with certainty. They were waiting to see if the toddler would speak, waiting to see if he could overcome the fear that hung on him like a heavy coat, waiting to see if the truth, whatever it might be, could emerge from the mouth of someone who had only just begun to string together sentences. The child's guardian sat beside him, whispering quietly, brushing a gentle hand across his back. She leaned close, her face filled with encouragement, though her own nerves betrayed her. She had seen the boy's strength before, had watched him endure things no child should, but she also knew how fragile he was. Today would be asking much of him, perhaps too much. She kissed the top of his head and whispered again, "It's okay. You're safe." Whether the words were meant to reassure him or herself, she wasn't sure. On the floor beside the bench, unnoticed by some but crucial to others, lay Bailey. The courthouse canine had been assigned specifically for this morning. A golden retriever with soft, well-groomed fur and eyes that seemed to hold endless patience. Bailey exuded calm in a way no human could. He rested quietly, his head on his paws, breathing slow and steady. He did not need to understand the law or the case. His purpose was simple, to be present, to offer comfort. And though the boy had not yet spoken a word, he occasionally reached down to rest his tiny fingers in Bailey's fur, drawing strength from the dog's warmth. The attorneys whispered among themselves, their voices too low to carry. They discussed procedure, evidence, strategy. Yet even they seemed unusually subdued, as though unwilling to disturb the fragile moment building around them. They knew the difficulty of what lay ahead. A child's testimony could be decisive, but only if it was given, only if it was believed. And belief required courage. The judge raised her gavel lightly, then let it fall with a controlled tap. "Court is now in session," she said, her voice carrying authority, yet softened by deliberate care. She glanced at the toddler again. For just a flicker of a second, her stern exterior wavered. She offered a small nod, as though to reassure him that, despite the grandeur of the room, he was safe here. The boy's small body stiffened at the sound of her voice. He clutched the rabbit tighter, his eyes darting nervously toward the judge. His breathing quickened, shallow and uneven. Bailey, sensing the shift, lifted his head slightly, pressing his warm body against the child's leg. The boy blinked, then looked down, meeting the dog's steady gaze. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile flickered at the corners of his mouth. The room, filled with adults carrying their own worries, unknowingly held its collective breath. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a stage for something much more fragile, much more profound. At its center was a toddler who didn't yet understand laws, rules, or evidence, but who carried a truth inside him, waiting for a chance to surface. And as the morning sun climbed higher, spilling brighter light across the polished floor, every person in that courtroom silently wondered, would he find the courage to speak? The tension in the room might have been unbearable, were it not for the silent figure at the child's side. Bailey, the courthouse canine, sat with the kind of poise that came only from years of specialized training and an innate gentleness. Golden fur gleamed under the courtroom lights, brushed to a soft shine that made him look less like an officer of the court and more like a living embodiment of comfort. His calmness seemed to radiate outward, wrapping around the small boy beside him like a blanket of reassurance. Bailey was not just any dog. He had been carefully selected as a courthouse companion animal after showing signs of extraordinary temperament. Unlike working police dogs trained for detection or apprehension, Bailey had been trained for the opposite: stillness, patience, and quiet empathy. His handlers often remarked that Bailey seemed to know when someone's heart was heavy, as if he could sense the very vibrations of fear or sadness in the air. His gift wasn't something that could be forced through drills. It was something he had been born with. This morning, that gift was on full display. While the attorneys shuffled through documents and whispered their last-minute strategies, Bailey lay stretched out beside the toddler's chair, his large paws crossed neatly, his tail resting motionless on the floor. He didn't fidget, didn't yawn, didn't allow the constant shuffling and murmuring to disturb his composure. Every now and then, his head tilted slightly, his ears pricking as if listening not to the people in the room, but to the unspoken rhythm of the child's breaths. The boy's breaths were uneven, quick, tinged with quiet panic. Bailey noticed. Without needing to be commanded, he shifted closer, pressing the warmth of his body against the toddler's leg. At first, the boy froze, startled by the movement. Then, slowly, his tiny hand lowered to the retriever's fur. The child's fingers curled gently, grasping a small tuft as though it were an anchor keeping him from drifting away in a sea of fear. Several spectators in the gallery noticed the exchange, though they dared not speak. Some pressed lips together to suppress unexpected smiles. Others blinked hard, their own eyes misting. They had entered the courtroom expecting sharp exchanges of legal language, not this small and tender bond forming silently between a child and a dog. Bailey didn't move after that. He simply stayed, his head resting on the edge of the wooden bench, his large brown eyes turned upward toward the toddler. He didn't demand attention, didn't seek affection, but his presence was undeniable. It was as though he were saying, "You're not alone. I'm here. Whatever happens, you're safe." The judge noticed, too. Though she had seen therapy dogs before, she could not help but feel a quiet admiration. The child was fragile, trembling in a world too big and too loud for him. Yet with Bailey at his side, something about the balance shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden burst of bravery. It was something subtler, quieter, a slow unwinding of fear. The bailiff, who had been standing with his usual rigid posture, softened when his gaze landed on Bailey. The dog reminded him of his own Labrador at home, though his dog had never been trained for such delicate work. Watching Bailey was almost humbling. The bailiff had always considered strength as something that came from authority, rules, and the firm voice he used to control a courtroom. Yet here was a dog showing strength without a sound, with nothing but stillness and patience. Bailey's handler sat quietly at the back, keeping a watchful eye. She had worked with him for years, through training sessions, courthouse visits, and endless interactions with children who needed him. She knew his patterns, his instincts, his subtle ways of communicating. And she could tell by the way his ears flicked and his body stayed pressed against the child that he was fully engaged, fully aware that this moment mattered. She smiled softly, pride swelling in her chest. Good boy, she thought, though she didn't say it aloud. The toddler, meanwhile, found himself pulling strength from the dog's nearness. At first, his touch was tentative, just the light brushing of fingers against fur. But gradually, his hand began to rest there longer. His grip tightened, not in fear, but in grounding. Each time he felt his chest tighten, or the weight of so many adult eyes pressing on him, his hand found Bailey. The steady thump of the dog's slow heartbeat seemed to remind him of something his young mind couldn't quite put into words, that he was safe in this moment, no matter how frightening it looked. The attorneys, for all their professionalism, couldn't help but notice the difference. One leaned toward the other, whispering, "Look at him. He's calmer already." They weren't sentimental by nature. They were focused on the case, on outcomes, on strategy. But even they knew that without Bailey, the boy might not manage to sit there at all. Minutes ticked by, each second an eternity in the slow churn of courtroom proceedings. Yet during those moments, a transformation small but profound was taking place. The child, who had arrived with wide eyes and trembling hands, was now breathing more evenly. His stuffed rabbit still lay in his lap, but it was Bailey, not the toy, that absorbed the child's grip. Where fear had gripped his chest only moments earlier, calm began to seep in. Not a flood, but a trickle. Enough to hold him steady. In the back of the room, a woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She wasn't directly connected to the case, but had come to observe out of civic duty. She hadn't expected to be moved. Yet something about the sight of innocence leaning on loyalty struck her deeper than any legal argument could. She thought of her own children, imagined them in such a position, and silently thanked whoever had thought to bring Bailey into the courtroom. The judge called for order, her voice steady, professional, but the corners of her mouth softened as her eyes flicked again to the child. She wasn't supposed to show preference, wasn't supposed to let emotion guide her reactions. But she was human, and like everyone else, she felt the quiet miracle unfolding. Bailey blinked slowly, his head still resting on the wood, his eyes never leaving the toddler's face. He didn't wag his tail too much. Movement might have been distracting. He didn't bark, didn't sigh, didn't demand anything. His entire presence was a lesson in restraint and patience. Yet it was working. Each breath the boy took became a little steadier, each glance toward the crowd a little less panicked. The child's body, which had been curled tight with anxiety, began to loosen, shoulders lowering as if some invisible weight had been lifted. In the silence, something shifted across the room. Fear had not disappeared completely. It never could in a place like that, but it had been challenged. And not by the stern voice of authority or the cold precision of law. It had been challenged by warmth, by fur, by the steady patience of a dog who asked for nothing in return. Bailey didn't know the details of the case. He didn't understand evidence or the stakes, or the way this child's words could alter the outcome of everything that followed. He only knew this. The child beside him needed him. And that was enough. For the boy, those moments with Bailey's warm body pressed against his leg planted the first seeds of courage. Courage not to face down the courtroom, but simply to breathe, to sit, to be. And though no one knew it yet, those seeds would soon grow into something that would shock everyone in that room. The attorneys would argue. The judge would preside. The jury would deliberate. But in that quiet moment, before words were spoken and evidence presented, the most powerful presence in the room was not the law, it was Bailey, the calm golden dog whose silence spoke louder than anything else. The bailiff's voice rang through the courtroom, calm but firm, announcing that the witness was to be brought forward. Though the words themselves were routine, the weight they carried this time was anything but ordinary. Every head in the room turned toward the tiny figure who was now expected to take center stage. A 3-year-old child, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, was about to be guided into the witness stand, a place that had, until now, been reserved for adults with steady voices and practiced composure. The boy's guardian leaned close, whispering softly in his ear. Her hand brushed his shoulder, guiding him to stand. He hesitated, small legs trembling, the enormity of the moment crushing over him. The boy wasn't old enough to understand the significance of legal testimony or the role he played in the broader case. All he knew was that dozens of eyes were fixed on him, waiting, expecting something he wasn't sure he could give. Bailey, the golden retriever, rose with him. The courthouse canine had sensed the shift in the room instantly. His body pressed closer to the boy's side, steady and grounding. The leash, held loosely by the handler, trailed just enough slack to allow Bailey to follow the child's every movement. Together, they approached the wide wooden stand. One tiny hand clutched the rabbit, the other brushed the smooth fur at his side. The courtroom was silent, except for the echo of small shoes tapping nervously against the polished floor. Each step seemed to last forever, a slow, hesitant journey across the vast space. The child's breaths came quick and shallow, and more than once he glanced over his shoulder, as though hoping someone would tell him it was okay to turn back. But no one did. His guardian whispered again, "It's all right. You're so brave." The boy didn't respond, but his grip on Bailey's fur tightened, and he kept walking. The witness stand loomed ahead, large, imposing, built for adults. The bailiff stepped forward, offering his steady hand. His voice softened, stripped of the authority he usually carried. "Here you go, buddy. Just a few more steps." He bent lower than usual, adjusting his posture to meet the boy's eye level. In that simple gesture, he showed the room what everyone already felt. This was not business as usual. With effort, the toddler climbed into the oversized chair. His feet dangled far above the floor, swinging in nervous rhythm. The wooden railing in front of him came up to his chest, making him look even smaller, swallowed by the structure built for grown men and women. The microphone, positioned high, stood like a towering sentinel, its red light blinking expectantly. The child's eyes widened at the sight of it. The judge leaned forward slightly, softening her tone. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, her voice stripped of its usual formality. "Can you hear me?" Her words were gentle, but the child still shrank back, unsure of how to respond. He nodded faintly, the movement barely visible, and pulled his stuffed rabbit tighter against his chest. Bailey sat directly at the base of the stand, resting his head on the platform's edge. The dog's steady presence seemed to tether the child to something safe, something familiar. The attorney chosen to begin the questioning rose slowly from his seat. Normally, his stride was confident, his posture commanding. But today, every movement was deliberate, softened, calculated to avoid overwhelming the child. He approached as though one wrong gesture might shatter the fragile courage holding the boy in place. Stopping a respectful distance away, he crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to the child's level. "Hi," the attorney said, his tone unusually light. "My name is Mr. Adams. Do you know why you're here today?" The boy's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes darted across the room, lingering on the unfamiliar faces. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Bailey shifted, pressing his nose gently against the side of the stand. The boy looked down at him, his hand automatically reaching for the golden fur. Still, he said nothing. A murmur rustled through the gallery. Spectators shifted, exchanging nervous glances. The tension was palpable. Even seasoned attorneys, usually hardened to courtroom pressures, felt the knot in their stomachs tighten. Asking a toddler to speak in front of strangers was monumental, perhaps too monumental. The judge, sensing the strain, leaned forward again. "Take your time," she said softly. "You don't have to rush. Just breathe." Her voice carried patience, but beneath it was the silent question everyone shared. Could this really work? Could a 3-year-old overcome fear long enough to offer the words the case depended on? The boy's guardian, seated nearby, clasped her hands tightly in her lap. She whispered encouragements, though the child could no longer hear her clearly. His world had shrunk to the wooden stand, the blinking microphone, and Bailey's unwavering gaze. The boy pressed his cheek into the rabbit's soft fur, seeking comfort. The toy had always been his shield, his constant companion during restless nights and moments of fear. But today, even the stuffed rabbit seemed too small, too powerless against the vastness of the courtroom. His hand searched for Bailey again, burying fingers into the retriever's thick coat. The dog didn't flinch, didn't move away. He simply stayed, as immovable as the wooden bench itself. The attorney tried again, this time with a simpler question. "Do you like dogs?" His voice was softer now, almost conspiratorial, as though sharing a secret. The boy's eyes flicked down to Bailey, then back up to the microphone. His lips trembled, and for a moment, it looked as though he might answer. But instead, he pulled back, lowering his gaze once more. A collective exhale rippled across the courtroom. It was clear to everyone, this was not going to be easy. But in that struggle, in the boy's silence and the dog's patience, the room felt something rare. They weren't just watching a testimony unfold, they were watching courage wrestle with fear, innocence collide with expectation. The bailiff stepped forward again, whispering gently, "It's okay, little man. You don't have to be scared. Bailey's right here with you." He reached down and gave the retriever a small scratch behind the ear, a gesture meant less for the dog than for the child watching. Bailey wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate, as though affirming the words. The toddler blinked, his gaze shifting once more to the dog's steady eyes. He didn't speak yet, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't just fear, it was hesitation softening into possibility. The judge, the attorneys, the gallery, they all waited, breathless. This was no ordinary witness stand, and this was no ordinary testimony. It was the fragile unfolding of a story too big for the small shoulders that carried it. And though no one could predict what would come next, one thing was already clear. The courage of a child, paired with the loyalty of a dog, had begun to change the room in ways no one expected. The room was still, yet the silence was not peaceful. It was suffocating. Every person present felt it pressing against them, as though the very air had thickened. A toddler sat high in the witness stand, feet dangling, clinging to his stuffed rabbit with one hand while the other burrowed into Bailey's fur. The microphone loomed in front of him, its tiny red light blinking, waiting. The attorney's gentle question had been asked. The judge had offered her encouragement, but the child's lips remained sealed. Seconds stretched into long, agonizing beats. The courtroom was no stranger to silence. Jurors often sat in it. Lawyers often used it to their advantage. But this was different. This silence carried fragility. It carried the weight of a child's fear. The boy's wide eyes flickered across, the sea of faces staring back at him, strangers whose expectation only deepened his paralysis. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to crawl down from the chair, hide his face in Bailey's fur, and never look up again. His heart hammered in his small chest, beating so loudly that to him it drowned out every other sound. His throat felt tight, words trapped like butterflies caught in a jar. The attorney crouched lower, lowering his voice even further. "It's all right, buddy," he said softly, almost whispering. "You don't have to be afraid. Can you tell me your name?" The boy blinked rapidly, eyes glistening. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. A tiny whimper escaped, but no words. The silence returned, heavier than before. In the gallery, people shifted uncomfortably. Some clasped their hands, others looked down at their laps, unwilling to witness the raw struggle of such a young child. A woman near the back dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, whispering under her breath, "He's just a baby." A man beside her nodded silently, his jaw clenched. The judge's expression softened, though her tone remained steady. "Take your time," she said again. Her gavel rested in her hand, though unused, as if she might call for a recess at any moment. She understood the fragility before her. If the child could not continue, she would not force it. The law had limits. Compassion demanded more. The boy's guardian leaned forward, her eyes glistening with encouragement. She mouthed silently, "You can do it," though the child did not look at her. His gaze stayed downcast, fixed on the wooden edge of the stand, where Bailey's head rested patiently. Bailey, sensing the heightening panic, shifted closer. His nose brushed against the boy's dangling shoe, a soft, grounding reminder of presence. The boy's small fingers curled tighter into the dog's fur, seeking reassurance. The golden retriever didn't move, didn't demand, didn't break the fragile stillness. He was a rock, a living anchor. Yet even with Bailey there, the boy could not bring himself to speak. His fear was too great. His breaths came shallow and quick, tiny shoulders rising and falling with effort. A single tear slipped down his cheek, tracing a small path before dripping onto the worn fur of the stuffed rabbit. The attorney hesitated, then tried again. "Do you like your bunny?" he asked gently, pointing at the stuffed toy. "What's his name?" It was a simple question, one any child might answer in a heartbeat. But the boy only stared, eyes wide and unblinking, as though the words had vanished from his mind. His lips moved slightly, but no sound emerged. Instead, his face tightened, and the tears threatened to come faster. A murmur rose in the gallery, quickly hushed by the bailiff's sharp glance. People were not supposed to comment, yet the room's collective sympathy was difficult to contain. They could all see it, the fear, the struggle, the fragile child perched in a chair far too large for him. The judge leaned toward the microphone. Her voice carried authority, but her words were careful, deliberate. "We can stop if we need to," she said. "The court does not want to cause you distress." Her eyes softened, betraying her neutrality for just a moment. She had seen hardened men cry on that stand, but watching a child tremble was different. It pierced deeper. The boy's guardian shifted, hands clasped tightly together. She wanted to rush forward, to scoop the child into her arms and shield him from the room's oppressive stares. But she knew she could not. This was his moment, however painful, and her role was to trust him, even when it broke her heart. The bailiff cleared his throat gently, stepping closer to the stand. He bent down, lowering his tall frame to speak quietly, just for the child. "It's okay, little man," he said in a voice stripped of formality. "Nobody here is going to hurt you. Bailey's right here, and we're all patient. You don't have to be scared." Bailey lifted his head slightly at the sound of his name, his ears twitching. The boy glanced down at him again, his tears slowing. His tiny hand stroked the dog's fur absent-mindedly, a reflex born of comfort. Still, his lips did not move. The attorney glanced toward the judge, silently asking whether to continue or stop. The judge hesitated, her brow furrowed. She knew the stakes of the case, the importance of testimony. Yet she also knew the limits of a child's endurance. Forcing him risked breaking him, and that was a line she would not cross. The silence stretched again, this time so long it became unbearable. In that silence, people began to imagine the trial collapsing. Evidence lost, truth buried beneath fear. Some wondered whether it had been foolish to expect so much from a toddler. Others silently prayed for something, anything, to break the tension. The boy squirmed in his seat, pressing his face into his rabbit's fur, hiding from the room. His breathing hitched, and it seemed certain he would cry. The courtroom braced for it, the collapse of courage, the end of the attempt. The judge even began to raise her gavel, ready to call for a recess. Then Bailey moved. It wasn't much, just a slow, deliberate lift of his head onto the wooden edge of the stand, placing his warm muzzle within inches of the child's trembling hand. His eyes, steady and soft, met the boy's tearful gaze. The dog didn't blink, didn't look away. He simply was. The boy paused, his small body frozen. For the first time since stepping into the stand, his shoulders eased just slightly. His lips pressed together, as though holding back words he was too afraid to release. Yet something shifted in his expression. The tears stopped flowing. His breath steadied just a little. The courtroom felt it, though no one spoke. It was as if the dog's presence had pulled the boy back from the edge of collapse. But still, no words came. Not yet. The gallery remained silent, hearts pounding in quiet anticipation. The attorneys exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to proceed. The judge lowered her gavel again, waiting. Everyone in the room leaned forward ever so slightly, drawn into the fragile drama unfolding on that wooden stand. The boy's small fingers curled tighter into Bailey's fur. His lips quivered, Something was building, unspoken, waiting. But whether it would become words or dissolve back into silence, no one could yet tell. And so the courtroom sat suspended, balanced between despair and hope, waiting to see whether fear would win, or whether something unexpected might break through. The silence in the courtroom lingered like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive, threatening to drown the fragile courage of the little boy seated in the witness stand. His chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths, tiny shoulders trembling beneath the oversized sweater that seemed to swallow him whole. Everyone feared the moment was lost, that the weight of expectation had pressed too hard on such small shoulders. Then Bailey moved again. The golden retriever, patient as the earth itself, adjusted his position. With deliberate calm, he leaned further into the stand, resting his chin directly on the polished wood near the boy's arm. His warm breath puffed softly against the child's sleeve, and his steady brown eyes never wavered. It was such a simple gesture, gentle, unassuming, but it changed everything. The boy blinked down at the dog, his tears slowing. The courtroom seemed to fade for him. The judge, the jury, the attorneys, all the strangers staring with expectation, melted into the background. What he saw instead was Bailey, calm, unbothered, trustworthy. The boy's small fingers, still clutched around his stuffed rabbit, relaxed just enough to reach toward the dog's ear. The gallery collectively held its breath. It was as if every heart in the room synchronized in that moment, beating softly with the hope that something would break through the wall of fear. The child stroked Bailey's fur, tentative at first, then firmer as comfort seeped in. His shoulders eased, his breathing steadied. For the first time since he had taken the stand, the boy's face softened, and the crease of terror between his brows began to smooth. Bailey, sensing the shift, let out a soft sigh, the kind dogs release when they've settled into peace. It was a sound so ordinary, yet it rippled through the courtroom like a melody. Even the judge leaned back in her chair, a faint smile flickering at the edges of her lips. The attorney seized the moment, though carefully, as though approaching a fragile bird. "He likes you, doesn't he?" he asked softly, nodding toward Bailey. The boy hesitated, his lips twitching as though he wanted to respond, but wasn't yet ready. His gaze shifted to the microphone, its blinking red light intimidating him. But then his eyes returned to Bailey, and the fear that had silenced him seemed to ebb, replaced by something quieter trust. A murmur ran through the gallery as the child leaned forward, his tiny lips parting. The microphone caught it, amplifying the sound so every corner of the courtroom heard it. 2 trembling words, spoken not to the attorney, not to the jury, but to the dog. "Good dog." The words hung in the air like a spark catching dry tinder. A ripple of emotion swept through the room, gasps, muffled sobs, and even a chuckle or two from those who could no longer hold back their relief. The judge herself allowed a soft exhale, her stern composure momentarily softened by the innocence of it. The boy's guardian pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. She had prayed for courage, for some sign of strength, and here it was, not in the grand, forceful way adults often imagined, but in 2 simple words. The attorney smiled, but did not rush. He knew to tread lightly. "That's right," he said warmly. "He is a good dog, and he's here for you. Do you think you can tell us your bunny's name now?" The boy's eyes flickered nervously across the room again, the sea of faces still daunting. But Bailey shifted, nudging his muzzle a little closer. The boy looked at him, then whispered again, softer this time, but with a touch more confidence. "Mr. Floppy." The courtroom responded with quiet laughter, a gentle release of tension that had bound everyone's chest. It wasn't ridicule, but joy, a recognition of the fragile victory unfolding before their eyes. The judge tapped her gavel once, though even her reprimand was laced with warmth. "Order," she said, though her eyes twinkled. Let's allow the witness to continue. From there, a transformation began. The boy, anchored by Bailey's steady presence, began to answer questions, not all, and not without hesitation, but enough. His words came in fragments at first, whispers that the microphone barely caught, but they were words nonetheless. The attorney kept his questions simple, guiding the child with patience. Each time the boy faltered, Bailey was there, resting his head closer, nudging his paw against the boy's shoe, radiating the kind of reassurance that no human voice could provide. And each time, the boy found his courage again. In the gallery, emotion swelled. Hardened officers blinked rapidly, fighting tears. A juror bit his lip, overwhelmed by the innocence of what he was witnessing. Even the bailiff, a man known for his stoicism, glanced away briefly, his jaw tightening as he swallowed emotion. It wasn't just testimony. It was something more. It was a child finding his voice in the presence of unconditional trust. It was a dog reminding a room full of adults of something they often forgot. That strength does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. The judge watched with rapt attention, her gavel unused as the testimony unfolded. In her decades on the bench, she had presided over countless cases, heard thousands of witnesses. But she knew this moment was unlike any other. She wasn't just watching evidence being presented, she was watching courage bloom in its purest form. When the boy stumbled over a difficult question, his lip trembling, Bailey shifted once again, brushing against his leg. The boy inhaled deeply, steadied himself, and whispered the answer. The courtroom froze, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they represented, a triumph of trust over fear. The guardian clasped her hands together tightly, whispering silent thanks. For days she had worried that the child would crumble under the pressure. Now she saw hope, not only for the case, but for the boy's spirit. By the time the attorney concluded his gentle line of questioning, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely changed. The heavy silence of dread had been replaced by something lighter, almost reverent. The boy had spoken. He had faced the unthinkable, and he had done it with the help of a golden-furred friend who asked nothing of him except trust. As the child was carefully lifted from the stand, still clutching Mr. Floppy, Bailey trotted alongside him, tail swishing gently. The boy bent his head close to the dog and whispered once more. Words the microphone didn't catch, but the closest row could hear. Thank you. And though no one in the courtroom translated, they all understood. That day, they had witnessed not just testimony, but a bond that defied expectation. It was a reminder that sometimes justice is not carried by laws or arguments, but by compassion, and that heroes don't always wear robes or badges. Sometimes they have 4 paws and a wagging tail. The moment came quietly, almost too quietly to notice. The boy sat perched on the witness stand, one tiny hand tangled in Bailey's golden fur, the other clutching his worn stuffed rabbit. His face was still blotchy from earlier tears, but his breathing had steadied. The courtroom had been holding its collective breath for what felt like hours. Every rustle of paper, every scrape of a shoe on the polished floor, sounded thunderous against the fragile silence. The attorney, careful not to break the fragile connection between child and dog, asked another question in a voice barely above a whisper. Can you tell us who's sitting with you? His words weren't just about the dog. He was offering the boy a lifeline, a chance to speak without confronting the intimidating faces around him. The boy's wide eyes flicked briefly to the microphone, its red light blinking like an unblinking eye, then darted back down to Bailey. His lips trembled, forming shapes without sound. For a long, excruciating moment, it seemed as though nothing would come. Then, with a breath so small it barely moved his chest, he leaned toward Bailey and whispered 2 words. Good dog. The microphone caught it, amplifying the phrase so it rang across the courtroom. The words were not shouted, not even spoken loudly, yet they struck like a lightning bolt. Two simple syllables ordinary in any other place suddenly carried the weight of a miracle. The effect was instantaneous. A ripple of emotion surged through the room. Jurors exchanged glances, some smiling through watery eyes. A woman in the gallery let out a sob she quickly tried to muffle. Even the judge, who had sat through years of testimony both harrowing and dull, felt her composure falter as the corners of her mouth softened. The boy's guardian pressed her hands against her face, her shoulders shaking with a mixture of relief and awe. She had prayed for a sign, for some sliver of courage, and here it was not wrapped in long sentences or eloquence, but in two words spoken from a place deeper than fear. The bailiff, a man known for his stoicism, cleared his throat quietly, blinking rapidly as if dust had suddenly stung his eyes. Even he couldn't deny the impact of those simple words. The attorney, careful not to rush the fragile victory, smiled warmly. "Yes," he said softly, "he is a good dog." His tone was not for the jury, nor the judge, nor the record. It was for the boy alone, reinforcing the connection he had just dared to voice. The child looked at Bailey again, and Bailey, as if understanding the weight of the moment, wagged his tail once in slow approval. The boy's lips curved into the faintest smile, tentative but real. For the first time that day, his fear loosened its grip. The gallery exhaled, as though they had all been holding breath for the same length of time. It wasn't just relief, it was wonder. They had witnessed courage born not of force, but of trust, and it humbled them. The judge leaned forward, her voice gentle, carrying warmth instead of authority. "Thank you," she said to the child, though everyone in the room felt she was thanking the dog as well. That was very brave. The boy blinked, surprised by the praise. No one had called him brave before, not like this. He clutched his stuffed rabbit closer, but didn't turn away. His shoulders no longer shook. The attorney tried again, gently nudging the child forward. "Can you tell me your bunny's name?" he asked, careful not to let the moment slip. There was another pause, but it wasn't as heavy as before. The boy's gaze darted to the microphone again, then dropped to Bailey. The golden retriever pressed closer, brushing his warm muzzle against the boy's dangling shoe. The boy giggled a sound so soft and fleeting that it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Into the microphone he whispered, "Mr. Floppy." Laughter broke through the courtroom, light and unrestrained, not cruel but joyous. The tension that had weighed on them all shattered. The judge tapped her gavel lightly, but her voice carried no sternness. "Order," she said, though her eyes twinkled. The boy's small smile grew. He hadn't meant to be funny, but the reaction didn't frighten him. It warmed him. For the first time, he realized that the room wasn't laughing at him. They were cheering for him in their own way. Bailey nudged him again, tail wagging, as if to say, "See? You're doing fine." The transformation was astonishing. A child who moments before could not lift his gaze now sat taller, his hand resting confidently on the canine's back. His words, though still few, came easier. The attorney guided him gently through the questions, each one answered with halting honesty. Some responses were whispers, some were nods, but all were evidence of a courage growing stronger by the second. The jurors leaned forward, not to scrutinize, but to listen with care. Hardened officers at the back of the room softened, their postures loosening as they, too, were drawn into the fragile power of the moment. Everyone understood. It wasn't the words themselves that mattered, but the fact that they existed at all. The boy had crossed the line from silence into voice, carried there by the steady companionship of a dog who asked for nothing but trust. The attorney eventually ended his questioning, knowing he had already been given more than he had dared hope for. As he returned to his seat, he glanced toward the jury, silently acknowledging that they, too, had witnessed something extraordinary. The judge cleared her throat, regaining her composure. "The witness may step down," she said softly. But her gavel remained unused. She didn't want to shatter the fragile magic that still lingered in the air. The bailiff approached, offering his hand to help the child climb down. Bailey rose alongside him, sticking close, his tail swaying gently, as if guiding the boy safely back to his seat. Before leaving the stand, the child bent close to Bailey and whispered something too quiet for the microphone to capture. Those seated nearest heard it, though. "Thank you, good dog." Tears glistened in more eyes than anyone admitted. The boy's words weren't for the record, but for the heart, and they echoed in everyone present long after the sound faded. For the rest of that day, the trial continued as usual, evidence presented, objections raised, arguments made. But the tone had shifted. The tension that had gripped the courtroom for hours was gone, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. People spoke in hushed tones during breaks, but their subject wasn't legal strategy or testimony. It was the child, and the two words that had turned the day. In every corner of the room, the lesson lingered. Sometimes the most powerful statements are the simplest, and sometimes the bravest voices are the smallest. And all it took was a boy, a dog, and two little words. The courtroom had changed. It wasn't visible in the walls or the benches, but in the atmosphere itself. Where there had once been suffocating silence and tension, there was now a strange kind of reverence. It was as though everyone present understood they had just witnessed something sacred. Two words, "good dog," had broken through the darkness, and in doing so, had sparked something much larger. The boy remained on the stand, Bailey's warm body pressed close against his leg. The stuffed rabbit, Mr. Floppy, was still tucked in the crook of his arm, but the grip around it had loosened. His breathing, once shallow and erratic, now came steadier, more measured. The microphone that had once seemed terrifying now simply sat before him, waiting, harmless. The attorney, recognizing the fragile miracle unfolding, knew he had to move carefully. The wrong question could undo everything, but the right ones might coax the boy's voice further into the light. He crouched low, his tone almost conspiratorial, as if he and the boy were sharing a secret. "Mr. Floppy is a very good name," he said with a smile. "Did you give it to him yourself?" The boy blinked at him, then down at his stuffed rabbit. His lips pressed together, but his eyes no longer darted wildly around the room. He stroked Bailey's fur, absent-mindedly, grounding himself in the dog's steady presence. Then, almost too softly to hear, he answered, "Yes." The microphone carried it, and the sound, though small, filled the entire room. The word was not broken by sobs, nor swallowed by fear. It was clear. It was the boy's voice. The jurors leaned forward, their pens forgotten. The guardian clasped her hands together, tears streaming down her cheeks, though her smile never wavered. The bailiff's jaw tightened, pride etched into his otherwise stoic face. The attorney's smile widened, but he kept his voice measured. "That's wonderful. You picked a strong name for him." He paused, then gently shifted. "And you're strong too, aren't you? Can you tell us? Do you remember the day you met Bailey?" The boy's eyes widened at the sound of the dog's name. He turned, looking at Bailey, whose tail gave a slow, reassuring wag. This time the answer came quicker, though still quiet. "Today." Another ripple went through the room. A juror actually chuckled softly, shaking his head in wonder. The attorney nodded encouragingly. "That's right. And he's your friend already, isn't he?" The boy's lips curved into the faintest smile. Yes, now it was undeniable. The words were no longer flukes. They were coming with rhythm, with intent. The child's voice, so recently smothered by fear, was finding a foothold. The attorney shifted, carefully beginning to ask questions that edged closer to the heart of the case. Each time, the boy faltered at first, but Bailey was there. When the child's eyes clouded with hesitation, the golden retriever pressed closer, resting his muzzle against the boy's shoe or brushing his paw against the bench. It was enough. Each time, the boy straightened, inhaled, and answered. What began as whispers grew into sentences. The volume remained small, but the clarity was undeniable. The microphone carried his testimony faithfully, allowing every juror, every lawyer, every spectator to hear the story no one thought the boy could tell. As his words built, so too did the emotion in the room. Officers who had sat through endless hours of trials found their throats tightening. Jurors scribbled notes with hands that shook not from fatigue, but from awe. Even the judge, seasoned by decades of testimony, leaned forward with her chin resting lightly on her hand, listening with the kind of rapt attention she rarely allowed herself to display. The boy's guardian wept quietly, but it was not sorrow, it was relief. For days she had worried that silence would bury the truth, that the child would be too small, too fragile, to carry the weight placed upon him. But now, watching his tiny figure steady itself with each word, she realized she had underestimated him. Courage had been inside him all along. It had only needed the right companion to call it out. The attorney asked one final, careful question, his voice steady. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that day? The courtroom froze. This was the heart of the case, the moment everyone had been dreading and praying for. Could such a young child, who minutes earlier couldn't even say his name, find the strength to recount what mattered most? The boy clutched Mr. Floppy tighter, his lower lip trembling. For a second, it seemed he might retreat again into silence. The attorney waited, refusing to push. The judge remained still, resisting the urge to intervene. Then Bailey shifted. The dog's head rose, pressing firmly against the boy's leg. His big brown eyes met the child's, unblinking, unwavering. The boy inhaled shakily, his small chest rising and falling as though preparing for something monumental. And then he spoke. The words came haltingly, broken at times, but they came. He told the story in fragments, his voice never rising above a whisper, but each piece painted a picture the court needed to hear. Every pause was filled not with silence, but with Bailey's steady presence. Every time fear threatened to choke him, the dog's warmth pulled him back. The courtroom listened in absolute silence. No shuffling of papers, no coughs, no interruptions. Only the boy's small, steady voice weaving through the air, carried by the microphone into the hearts of everyone present. By the time he finished, the air felt electric. Not because the testimony was polished or dramatic, but because it was real. It was raw honesty from the lips of someone too young to pretend, too innocent to fabricate. The judge leaned back, her eyes glistening. She had presided over countless testimonies, but she knew she would never forget this one. The attorney's voice was thick when he finally spoke. "Thank you," he said gently. "You were very brave." The boy's cheeks flushed pink at the praise. He reached down to Bailey, stroking the dog's fur with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. His smile was small, but it was there. As the bailiff approached to guide him down from the stand, the gallery erupted into hushed murmurs. People exchanged looks of awe, some shaking their heads as though they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Others wiped at their eyes, unashamed of their tears. The boy climbed down carefully, Bailey trotting beside him. At the bottom of the steps, the child leaned in, whispering something into the dog's ear. Those closest caught it. "We did it." And though the words were for Bailey alone, the truth of them echoed through the entire room. The powerful breakthrough had come, not through force, not through pressure, but through the bond between a frightened child and a patient, loyal canine. What had seemed impossible only an hour earlier had unfolded before their very eyes. For the rest of the day, The trial continued in its formal rhythm, but no one could shake the image of the small boy on the stand, voice trembling yet strong, guided by the steady heartbeat of a golden retriever by his side. It was testimony, yes, but it was also something more. It was proof that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from authority or power, but from love. And sometimes the most powerful allies in a courtroom don't wear suits or badges. They wear fur and carry trust in their eyes. That day, everyone learned that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. *1. When the little boy stepped down from the witness stand, guided gently by the bailiff and flanked by Bailey's steady presence, the room did not simply return to normal. The usual rhythm of a courtroom shuffling papers, clicking pens, the droning voices of lawyers resuming arguments felt almost impossible to reclaim. What had just unfolded was not routine, not procedural. It was something else entirely, something that would linger long after gavels fell and transcripts were filed. The child returned to his guardian's side, clutching Mr. Floppy, cheeks still flushed, but now from triumph rather than fear. Bailey curled beside him, stretching out with the contentment of a job well done. The dog's tail swished lazily against the polished floor, the only sound in a room still steeped in awe. The judge cleared her throat, but her voice was softer than it had been all day. The record will reflect the completion of the child's testimony. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes lingering on the boy. Then, with an almost imperceptible smile, she added, "And the court expresses its gratitude for his bravery." It was unusual for a judge to step outside of pure formality, but no one objected. Everyone knew the moment demanded acknowledgement. The attorneys sat in silence, their usual sharp edges softened. The prosecutor, who had spent weeks preparing every detail, looked down at his notes but did not write. He knew that no amount of cross-examination or legal maneuvering could outweigh what had just been said in the simplest of voices. The defense attorney, often eager to pounce on inconsistencies, seemed subdued, as though even he recognized the futility of challenging a child's courage when witnessed so plainly. The jurors, too, felt it. They shifted in their seats, not out of boredom or fatigue, but because they were processing something deeper than evidence. They had come expecting to evaluate facts, to weigh testimony like stones on a scale. Instead, they found themselves measuring something else entirely, the strength of the human spirit. During the recess that followed, the courtroom emptied into the hallway, but the conversation was not of statutes or precedent. Strangers whispered about the moment the boy had said, "Good dog," about the way his voice had grown steadier, about the golden retriever whose calm gaze had made the impossible possible. A woman who had been sitting in the gallery leaned against the wall, wiping her eyes. "I'll never forget that," she murmured to no one in particular. "Never." A man beside her nodded. "I've sat through trials before, but this was different." "That little boy?" He trailed off, unable to finish, shaking his head in wonder. Even the court staff, hardened by years of routine, found themselves unsettled in the best of ways. The bailiff, usually stoic, bent down to scratch Bailey behind the ears. "Good job, buddy," he muttered, his gruff tone unable to hide the warmth beneath it. Bailey wagged his tail, unconcerned with praise, simply happy to have done his duty. Back inside the chamber, the judge sat alone at the bench during the short break, her gavel resting quietly at her side. She stared at the empty witness stand, reflecting. She had overseen testimonies from politicians, experts, criminals hardened by decades of violence. Yet it was a toddler, barely old enough to string full sentences together, who had moved her more deeply than anyone else. The law was written in books, but justice, she realized, was often written in moments like these. When the court resumed, the day moved forward, motions filed, witnesses called, arguments made, but the undercurrent remained. Every word, every piece of evidence, now existed in the shadow of what had already been spoken. The jurors no longer looked at the trial as just another case. They looked at it through the lens of a boy's courage and the silent strength of a golden-furred companion. The child's guardian held him close throughout the remainder of the day, whispering encouragements, though it was clear he no longer needed them. Something in him had shifted. Where there had been only fear, now there was a flicker of pride. He had spoken when no one thought he could. He had faced the gaze of strangers and found his voice. Bailey stayed beside him, occasionally resting his head on the boy's lap, occasionally glancing around the room with a quiet vigilance that reminded everyone why he was there. But in truth, no one doubted anymore. The mission had already been accomplished. By the time court adjourned, the air outside was cooler, the sun casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. People spilled onto the sidewalk, their conversations still echoing the day's events. It wasn't the case itself they discussed, not the legal intricacies or the potential verdict. It was the boy. It was the two words. It was the dog. One juror, stepping out with another, whispered, "I don't think I'll ever look at testimony the same way again." The other nodded, eyes distant. "Me neither." Inside, as the child was led toward the doors, he paused to kneel beside Bailey. Wrapping his tiny arms around the dog's neck, he buried his face in the golden fur. Bailey leaned into the embrace, patient, unhurried, as though he understood the gravity of the moment. "Thank you, good dog," the boy whispered again, his voice muffled but clear enough for those nearest to hear. It was not just gratitude, it was recognition. Bailey had not only helped him speak, but had given him courage he didn't know he had. The guardian wiped her eyes, watching as the boy rose, hand still clutching Mr. Floppy, and walked out the doors with Bailey at his side. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in healing, not just for the case, but for the child's future. That night, long after the courthouse emptied, those who had been present carried the memory with them. The judge replayed it in her mind as she sat at her desk, writing notes for the next day. The attorneys thought about it as they prepared their arguments, knowing that whatever else was said, those two words would remain the trial's heartbeat. The jurors carried it home, sharing it in whispers with spouses and children, unable to keep the story to themselves. And Bailey? Bailey went home, ate his dinner, and curled up on his bed, content. He did not need to understand the magnitude of what had happened. For him, it had simply been another day of doing what he was trained to do, offering presence, patience, and unconditional trust. But in doing so, he had left an imprint on dozens of lives. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond the courthouse. Whispers turned into retellings, and retellings turned into headlines. People marveled at the courage of a toddler who found his voice and the canine who gave him the strength to use it. Letters arrived at the courthouse, some addressed to the judge, others simply to the little boy and the dog. Teachers shared the story with their students. Parents told it to their children at bedtime. And so, what began as a fragile, fleeting moment became a lasting lesson. That strength does not always come in loud declarations or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it is found in the quiet presence of a friend. Sometimes it lives in two simple words spoken by a trembling voice. That day, the courtroom learned something no law book could teach. They learned that justice is not only about truth, it is also about compassion. And they learned that sometimes the most powerful testimony comes not from the polished orators, but from the smallest among us, guided by loyalty on four paws. For years to come, those who had been there would remember. They would remember the hush of the courtroom, the trembling silence, the sudden spark of courage. They would remember the golden retriever with calm eyes and a wagging tail. They would remember the boy who whispered, "Good dog," and in doing so, reminded them all of what it meant to be brave. And though trials would continue, and new cases would fill the docket, that single moment remained etched into memory. The day a toddler spoke, and a dog listened, and the whole courtroom was forever changed.